What's poppin'? I'm Becca and welcome to today's video. If you're new here, I primarily make fashion content, analysis, and predictions, and I also do movie commentaries where I watch my childhood favorite movies and shows as an adult. Today's video is a fashion analysis video, so if you're into that kind of thing, be sure to subscribe. I know everyone barely remembers 2020, but it was a very interesting time for the way that people dressed. It was a time when aesthetics had come to the forefront of fashion and people were allowed to discover who they were as people and what aligned with their values. While that's great and amazing, the issue with aesthetics is that these days they're not just a reflection of someone's personal style concerning its appeal or the philosophy behind it. Aesthetics are directly derived from subcultures, which isn't doing anyone any favors, especially the people who have started and who are still members of those subcultures. It is perfectly well to experiment with the way that you dress, how you decorate a space, and how you go about with your daily life. However, when people started this with the intention of simply having the time to do so, the intention of self-expression and discovery quickly turned into a performance for, you guessed it, social media. Social media has caused fashion to turn into something that I will kindly call less than fun. There are definitely moments that are good, and I feel like designers and stylists and bloggers turned influencers are slowly finding their way out of the machine, but it was during this time where the cap of all the commercialization of fashion came to a head. What began as subcultures turned very quickly into trends and performances. It's also interesting to see how these trends came to play with aesthetics, since something becoming trending only confirms that it is finite. This concept is especially harmful to subcultures that represent actual ethnicities, people's actual cultures that they've always dressed, spoken, and went about life a certain way. Seeing those as aesthetics and essentially a trend continues to hurt and undermine people of those cultures. The look is taken often without credit, while the people continue to be degraded and discarded in society. Let's get into how aesthetics almost replaced personal style. During the 2010s, something was lost in fashion due to the continuation of commercialization of the industry as a whole. With runways and publications specifically becoming more commercialized, it seemed everything was being produced with one thing only in mind: to sell. Once upon a time, that wasn't the case. Essentially, everything below high-end designer looked to fashion shows and magazines on what to do next and produce their clothing in accordance with industry standards. Commercialization entered and threw that out the window, and selling became the primary focus on all sectors of the industry. Aesthetics were adjacently taking place during this time, with the resurgence of grunge and punk and things like Instabaddie and hypebeast style, which is commonly associated with streetwear that had trickled down and were appropriated from hip-hop culture. You began seeing things like "this is my aesthetic" or "that's so aesthetic" used to describe people in places that followed a sort of formula that added up to an overall cohesive image. This is also when the influencer situation began to sink its meaty claws into social media, and people quickly began to define themselves as much as possible for the sake of views, but very often ended up looking like different versions of the exact same thing. Personal style and identity. Personal style has always existed in some contexts since people have existed. Appearance is taken seriously in many different contexts among species globally, and it will never not be used in that way. Humans specifically have always used the way we dress to define culture and who we are as people. Wealth, gender, sex, age, marital status, and a plethora of other things can be announced with a specific culture just by what someone wears, so this isn't new. Personal style is prevalent as we know it today. I'll focus on the 70s because that's just a fun time for fashion, minus all the times that it wasn't so fun. Bell-bottoms, platforms, and glamour defined a generation, but that's not how everyone dressed all the time. Little things that people added to their wardrobe differentiated them from people of different places in socioeconomic class and ethnicity. The decades before us provided us with rich fashion that can be pinpointed within each decade. Loafers of the 60s, bell-bottoms of the 70s, and the resurgence and exaggeration of shoulder pads in the 80s, the oversized and lack of clothing in the 90s into the 2000s, and the hodgepodge of whatever this was during the early 2010s has left the industry and people a bit lost. Aesthetics integration with personal style. Not knowing where to look, people seem to need to grasp onto the first thing that they could find, and the whole aesthetic thing replacing personal style seemed to be the answer. Now currently, it seems like people have a better time at discerning the difference between aesthetic and personal style, so that's great. Ultimately though, the introduction of aesthetics as personal identifiers as a way to define not only the way you look, but who you are as a person was a mistake. This is primarily because of where we are in the production of clothing and where these aesthetics originate from. So let's look into that briefly, shall we? Most subcultures as we know them today began in the 80s, or at the very least were popularized in the 80s. Punk, grunge, and goth all coincide with their respective music genres. Punk began long before the 80s, as early as the 1960s. In the 70s, the music genre was solidified by proto-punk created by a band called Death, who laid the groundwork for the beliefs of the subculture that encompassed the woes of the working class being anti-war and imperialist. This subculture wasn't so much as adopted as an aesthetic, but it was completely whitewashed throughout history. This can be seen with the remnants of punk and the aspects of that culture that were maintained throughout history. Grunge as a music genre is the bridge between mainstream heavy metal and post-punk alternative music. It has the same core as punk but without the fast beats. Goth also came after punk and is a direct derivative of gothic rock. This subculture differs from the other two because instead of overt politics, it was based in spirituality, subtle ethics, individualism, and the overall fashion and femininity that encompasses the goth look. All of these subcultures eventually hit mainstream, and in this context, mainstream will equal when these subcultures were reduced to aesthetics by being conformed into pop culture. Marc Jacobs was the first to bring the grunge aesthetic to the runway. Even though many would consider this to be pop culture, mainstream designer fashion is still associated with art, meaning it is still somewhat obscure to the mainstream. Marc Jacobs' Spring-Summer 1993 collection for Perry Ellis is what got Jacobs dropped from the label, while also receiving the CFDA Designer of the Year award in 1993. Since the label rejected the designs, they were sent to Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain, who at the time were very much still associated with the punk scene, and burned them because they did not like commercialization they represented. While Jacobs claimed that the show wasn't about plaid or cashmere or silk dresses, but quotes, it was about a sensibility and also about a dismissal of everything that one was told was beautiful, correct, glamorous, sexy. I love that it represented a newness. I think that's how people dress now. I think that moment hasn't passed. It's morphed into different things, but it really hasn't passed. Regarding punk, Vivienne Westwood was coined as the mother of punk throughout the 70s and 80s. With little of the originators and even those who continued its legacy who were a part of the working class were given credit for. While Westwood should be given credit for what she did visually regarding the genre, it was more of her and Malcolm McLaurin's work that captured and commodified the energy and iconoclastic tendencies of the movement. However, their work with sex, and specifically McLaurin's work with the Sex Pistols, was pushing punk further into a mass marketing frenzy that it never recovered from. The aesthetic punk is very much still here, but the ideology with that aesthetic, not so much. Goth is different because many designers like Drew of Lip Service already cater to the goth subculture. Since this subculture is so heavily defined by what people look like than what they believe in, its integration into mainstream happened quickly. But it also had many other subcultures to compete with during this time. Goth was already an aesthetic soon after its creation. Many goths come from middle-class suburban neighborhoods, but even the obscurity of the subculture has survived appropriation in late-stage capitalism. The body aesthetic, spirituality, and in later years fetishism provided it with an other status that was considered obscure even among other subcultures. When marginalized groups participate in this subculture, it is often seen as more subversive and extreme. Now let's talk about hip-hop. Hip-hop began in the 70s and was solely created for Black people to express their experiences during that time. Hip-hop evolved quickly, and very much like blues, jazz, and R&B, it was appropriated, where its people were left out of the equation when it became mainstream, something that continues to happen in cycles today. Hip-hop culture is an especially interesting case because it is one of the few subcultures that represents more than a socio-economic or political view. It is the culture of an entire ethnicity, an entire race of people in a specific place. Recently, the Gucci scandal with Dapper Dan, where they appropriated this specific style, was considered pop culture. However, hip-hop and other cultures are no stranger to this. Chanel's 1991 collection proved that. High-end fashion as a whole has a very intimate and often downplayed relationship with hip-hop, where many seem to forget that these brands have survived because of the attraction to the culture, whether it is currently in the mainstream or not. The same thing has happened and continues to happen to most cultures, unfortunately. The modern boho aesthetic or style is a result of the blatant appropriation of cultural dress of Romanian and Bohemian people during the 60s and 70s. More recently, Japandi interior design is a result of Scandi/European cultures only taking the most minimal and profitable aspects of Japanese architecture. Textbook appropriation, considering it ignores the cultural meaning and significance of Japanese architecture and interiors, and other elaborate concepts like this that don't fit into that minimalist viewpoint. As mentioned before, today there are billions so-called aesthetics, and they all stem from these subcultures. Sneakerheads, the baddie, streetwear, all come directly from hip-hop culture. They are the most palatable but even more notably profitable aspects of the culture. With grunge and punk, many love mohawks, plaid, distressed oversized clothing, and safety pins and other metal hardware, but the individuals who still participate in those subcultures have essentially been forgotten. It is especially harmful to see how these subcultures got adopted as aesthetics for that reason. Culture cannot exist without people. All cultures are meant to uphold and root people of a similar background in unity. People that grew up with these principles tend to not go around adopting only the most palatable of other cultures unless it has something to do with profit. Subcultures that recently popped up and immediately got co-opted as aesthetics. To further explain, the cottagecore and dark/light academia subcultures will be used to show why conflating subcultures with only aesthetics and using aesthetics as self-identifiers should ultimately come to an end. These subcultures existed before the pandemic, but were popularized during a time where the only focus was on social media. People adopted these subcultures, reveling in the community they provided until they just didn't anymore. Many of the videos on TikTok show the people enjoying the sun and the nature around them. It rejects the fast-paced lifestyle of many people who endured and are drained by it. On the other hand, the academia trend was portrayed one for intellectuals who enjoyed art and literature. Both of these quickly succumbed to being reduced down to their imagery and cute things and looking a certain way, much faster and deliberately than any of the other subcultures mentioned above. These subcultures turned into aesthetic trends so quickly that it would be extremely hard to see anyone still participating in them today. The issue comes from fashion trends' relationship with social media and how it accelerates them into literal oblivion. How social media positively and negatively affected that. The positive effects of social media has on this phenomenon are minuscule to the negative effects. Positively, you can choose to find new cultures that you align with and potentially create a community that stands for something outright or by little actions that defy the status quo and contribute to making society a better place as a whole. Social media brought these people together and highlighted the negative connotations, often classist and racist aspects of these subcultures so that they became more inclusive, which is overall positive. Social media is a performance and in many cases can never be casual or simply just for fun again, unless you really are that person that posts whatever they want to, whenever they want to, without a single thought behind it, or if your account is on private. As many videos and posts that were genuinely informative about cottagecore specifically, there were plenty that only showed it as an aesthetic, the identity that was adopted as a complete performance. And that is what all subcultures turned aesthetics have been transformed into. The aesthetics are watered down, gentrified, appropriated versions of their respective subcultures. Using these aesthetics to self-identify is a continuation of commercialization of fashion and subcultures until they essentially have no cultural meaning at all. Profit is always at the forefront, and once a self-identifier isn't suitable anymore, it is thrown out and demeaned. Hip-hop culture specifically has been co-opted. The reality is that people have dressed like this long before 2016. Once upon a time, Air Jordans were just J's or simply Jordans. Air Forces or Nike Airs were just one. Culture vultures were far and few in between, but for the past decade, they have swarmed. All the while, the people who are tied to these identifiers are demonized and ignored in mainstream media and continue to have to fight for equity and equality today. What does this mean for subcultures as a whole? Something as simple as unifying people through nature and simple interests outside of capitalism and the human condition was turned into a cute look. Using these subcultures derived aesthetics was a mistake because it is a continuation of the death of subcultures. The death of subcultures was first addressed about a decade ago, the same time color schemes were being adopted, but even more so confused with aesthetics. Blue is not an aesthetic. It is a color scheme. However, a specific aesthetic can have a color palette, but that usually tends to lead to restrictions. When people realized that colors, or using a single color to self-identify, was actually hindering them, that's when people began to repeat history and appropriate from actual culture. Restrictions of appearance is also something that doesn't work as self-identity because unless it is a part of your actual personal style, it is never going to last. People are people, and forcing yourself to look and only look into things for social media or any kind of clout in itself is somewhat unnatural and definitely unsustainable. That's not what having an identity is, but it is what eventually finding your own personal style and identity could look like. In time, the big leap from one aesthetic to another became so apparent because of how vastly different aesthetics can be. So instead of having actual personal style and identifying with yourself with that, people use aesthetics, subcultures, instead, as mentioned earlier. This is why subcultures do not survive in our society today. Learn who you are as a person and then decide how you want to look later, not the other way around. That way, it becomes a lot harder for corporations and brands to further exploit subcultures and everyone in society and continue this central issue. To say that these subcultures is something of an insult to where they actually come from, especially to the people that popularize them. This video isn't meant to bash anyone for dressing like a certain way, but to be aware of the harm that comes from being a mimic in fashion and only dressing a certain way, looking a certain way, and even acting a certain way because it's cool in the moment. This is also a means to encourage self-discovery and take a step back and question why and how you even came to like or dislike the aesthetics of today. Do you know where those long nails came from? That hair, those shoes, that jacket, that headpiece? Do you like or respect them, or do you just want to look different from people around you before you even get to know who you really are? And as far as the fashion industry is concerned, maybe it's time to put the cultural appropriation to rest for good. Stop relying on controversy, hype, and influencers to bring attention to your designs. With all that was a lot. But I hope that you got the point across and that you understand what I'm trying to say. Again, I'm not trying to bash anyone for the way that they dress, just to think about what you're doing and if it is something that you really like, or if you just feel like it's something that you have to wear because of what you see on social media and all of that. So what do you think aesthetics have done to personal style as a whole? Do you think that they've helped them? Do you think that they've pushed people farther away from discovering their own personal style? Do you think it's possible for fashion and fashion industries to stop appropriating cultures for their designs? Do you think that that's something? Because it's been happening since the dawn of the dawn. Do you feel that the era of aesthetics is coming to an end, or do you feel like things are somehow going to take a step backwards? And do you feel that people would be more inclined to find their personal style, or if trends will be shaped in a kind of way where people are manipulated into thinking they're doing that, but ultimately it's the same old? Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know your thoughts down below. All of my socials are linked in the description box. If you like this video, feel free to like this video, subscribe for more, and there will be another video next week. Thank you so much again for watching. I love you. Bye. These videos exemplify how